Thank you, Tom. I just want to add one other credential since it relates to what I'm going to say briefly before introducing the panel, and that is I'm currently completing a biography of Mikhail Gorbachev. And in fact, he was supposed to come to Amherst on May 4th. But a few days ago, we got word from him that he won't be able to come because of health concerns. And just this morning, I got an email from his aide saying he would be happy to talk to me and my wife again in Moscow if we can bring ourselves there, which I hope we can do. I've been asked to say a few words of my own before introducing the panelists to say a few words of their own. And what I thought I would do is draw upon my research on Stalin, Khrushchev, and Gorbachev. I did not write a biography of Stalin, but I wrote a book called Stalin's American Policy. And what I thought to do in just a few minutes is talk about the way in each case they and their policies were, at the time, misunderstood, controversial in U.S.-Soviet relations. But now, looking back as an historian, and I hope others can see that certain things that were not so clear at the time are quite clear now. And so these might be three postcard pictures of moments in the Cold War in which a lot depended on our reading of these leaders, which at the time was, as I say, controversial, but it now seems much clearer. So let me start with Stalin. If you followed the history of the Cold War and the debate about that history, you know that there used to be a debate about who started the Cold War, who was to blame for the Cold War. And in that debate, there was a lot of attention given to mistakes made by the United States, by Roosevelt, in being in some ways slow to awake to the danger that Stalin was going to pose, perhaps even unintentionally encouraging him to think he could expand in areas of Eastern Europe where in the long run we were not going to tolerate that kind of expansion. There had been criticism of the perhaps excessive militarization of the American conduct of the Cold War. But when I look back, and I think when most historians do now, they say Stalin was really the primary source and cause of the Cold War in a very particular sense. Here was a man who was certifiably paranoid to the point where he killed off some of his own relatives, many of his own associates, millions more of his own fellow citizens. And so if you ask the question, was there any way in which the West, the United States in particular, could have gotten along with this man without his being convinced that we were his enemies? The answer is probably no. If he thought all these other people were his enemies, how could he not think that we were? And that put us in a bind, because what that meant was that when we tried to reach out to him and accommodate him, which we did at some point at the end of World War II and briefly thereafter, he was all too likely to reach the view that this was a trick, because that's what happens when you suspect, you imagine enemies and you're convinced they are your enemies. And then, on the other hand, when we turned around, as we did a few years later, especially under Truman, and got tough with the Soviet Union, then he was likely to think, and he did think, well, you see, I knew it all along. They're irredeemably hostile to us, irretrievably dangerous, and so all they've done by getting tougher on us is proving that I was right all along. Then I think about Khrushchev. Khrushchev was, of course, Stalin's successor and quite different in many ways that I won't go into. In retrospect, as I wrote my book, I was convinced more and more that he was in favor up to a certain point of reforms at home. He gave the secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes in 1956. He wanted to ease the Cold War, if not end it. And we didn't really understand this. But I don't blame us as much as I, in the end, blame him, because he made it almost impossible for us to understand him. Adam Ulam, the late professor of Russian Soviet politics at Harvard, had a phrase for it. He said, Khrushchev's attitude toward the West was, be my friend or I'll break your neck. And that's essentially what he did. He wanted to ease the Cold War, but we ended up with its two most intense crises on his watch, the Berlin crisis and the Cuban crisis. So he was a hard man to understand. I think I can explain, I try to explain in my book why he issued an ultimatum on Berlin, why he put the missiles in Cuba. It's quite complicated, but it didn't look complicated, and I think it was all too easy to interpret those moves as threats to which we had to respond rather aggressively. The third case, this is, I hope, very short, is Gorbachev, about whom I'm writing now. I think Gorbachev, in contrast to Khrushchev, wanted not only to ease the Cold War, but actually to end it. And we know that he did. The relative credit that should be given to Reagan and Gorbachev for ending the Cold War is something that we might talk about. I tend, along with Reagan's biographer, to give much more credit to Gorbachev, but I can explain why if you're interested. On the domestic front, what Gorbachev did was transform communism. He went far beyond what Khrushchev was willing to do. He eliminated the Communist Party's monopoly of power. He transformed communism at home. Now, you might think that by 1989, by which point he had moved out of Afghanistan, Soviets were out of Afghanistan in the spring of '89, he had allowed mostly free elections for a real, rather than a rubber stamp, Soviet parliament. He had introduced glasnost, under the aegis of which all kinds of writers, including Solzhenitsyn and others, could be published and were published. And he even had Ronald Reagan to vouch for the seriousness of what he had done when Reagan was asked in Red Square in Moscow, 1988, June 1988, what he thought of, wasn't this still an evil empire? And he said, it's a new era. So Reagan vouched for it too. And yet, I remind you, as you might remind your students, if you're ever teaching this, that when George Bush came in January 1989 as the new American president, replacing Ronald Reagan, he declared a pause in US-Soviet relations in order to see whether Gorbachev was for real, in order, in effect, to test whether Ronald Reagan had been correct when he swore that Gorbachev was for real. And so it wasn't until December of 1989 in Malta that the next US-Soviet summit occurred, a whole year after the previous one in New York in December 1987, and we know that Gorbachev had expected there to be another one almost immediately. Hold it. The one in New York was December 1988 at the United Nations, and the next one wasn't until December 1989. Gorbachev had expected there to be one almost immediately after Bush took power. And one final example, in 1991, when Gorbachev was desperate for support from the West because his economy was collapsing around him, and he practically begged for aid from the West. If he'd gotten what he wanted, it would have been on Marshall Plan scale. What he got instead of dollars was strokes from Bush in particular. So in other words, even in the case of Gorbachev, who, unlike Stalin, who had started the Cold War, and Khrushchev, who had tried to ease it but ended up aggravating it, Gorbachev had ended it. He had transformed his country, and what he got in the end was strokes on the arm and pats on the back, but little more. Again, one could talk about why, and one could even consider the case for not aiding him on the grounds that it was too late to really help him. But these are examples from my own work that I thought about when I thought about how the Cold War is taught or might be taught in high school. Okay, that's enough of me. Let me now introduce our panelists one by one in accordance with the order of their speaking, if I can. Yes. First panelist is Richard Goldberg, classroom teacher for over 45 years, 27 years at Brookline High, undergraduate work at the University of Rochester, master's degree in modern European history, and a secondary teaching credential from University of California, Berkeley. Completed his doctorate in education at Boston University. Mr. Goldberg. I don't know whether you want to come up. If you have a microphone, you may want to stay there, whatever you'd like to do.
I'll stay here.
Okay.
Am I being heard? Okay. What exactly is my charge?
You mean your indictment? Actually, I am not sure. I mean, it's interesting that the two keynote speakers and I have spoken rather generally about Cold War issues, but obviously you and Mr. Kostka, who are high school teachers who've dealt with the Cold War, have dealt with it in that context. So if I were asking you the question, which I guess I am, since I'm the moderator, I would say, how is the Cold War taught in high schools, if it is indeed, and if there are shortcomings in the way it's taught, how can they be fixed?
Well, I can do that in one word. The Cold War is taught superficially, like everything else in high school. The Cold War is actually probably taught in two places. One would be in world history, in probably the 10th grade, and then again in the 11th grade in U.S. history. And I think the emphasis in world history would be contextualizing the Cold War as an event in the shape of World War I and World War II, as it affected the entire world. In U.S. history, probably the focus is on McCarthyism and the domestic fallout of the Cold War.
So that sounds as if the kinds of issues, or quite a few of the kinds of issues that were mentioned by Ann Applebaum and Edmund Morris, and by myself to a lesser extent, are not taught much at all.
Well, I think one of the problems with history is it just keeps happening.
Claire Booth Luce again, huh?
So in fact, when I was in high school, Vietnam wasn't even on the radar. And today, Vietnam is as far from us as World War I was when I graduated from high school. Mm-hmm. So we try to teach Yalta. We're lucky if we get to Reagan. And I would just say that that's a one-word answer, and that's June. We run out of time. This might strike the event today as somewhat of a surprise, but to most of my students, the Cold War is just another historical event in the past. It's not really of great interest. They don't really know about the Soviet Union. If we're going to get to things like Ferguson or climate change, we have to make some choices.
Would it help, or do you already do this, in approaching the Cold War, to think of raising the general issues that it raises, rather than simply preceding Yalta, Korea? I mean, you can raise the issues that way, chronologically, but would it help to turn the Cold War into a historical problem, historiographical problem?
I think to try to understand the Cold War in a non-ideological way would be to try to get people to see how people other than themselves might see the event. And I think to understand the Cold War, you would actually have to have a pretty thorough grounding in the World War I and World War II and the tremendous costs that the Soviet Union expended. I think recent events with Putin would seem to indicate, to me at least, that our problems with Russia probably have less to do with the system that they are under than the geopolitical concerns of the Russian government.
Yeah, we used to, during the Cold War, those of us who taught it at the college level used to explore the argument that the Soviet Union needed a Cold War, or at least an external enemy abroad, to justify its domestic oppression at home. That was one way of thinking about the Soviet behavior. Another had to do, of course, with the sacrifices in World War II and the genuine as well as imaginary fears of its leader. But that kind of question, which occurs to me as a college teacher, I don't know, does that ring a bell, or would that work, or would it not work in the absence of much more detailed knowledge than high school students are likely to have of the way the Soviet system worked and the way in which it might therefore have needed to point to a hostile world to justify the sacrifices it demanded of its citizens?
In order to answer the big questions, you obviously have to be pretty grounded in narrative, and that's another trap that history teachers fall into, which is that we want to cover as much as we possibly can, and in doing that, the big ideas and the big questions frequently get lost.
What's the balance in your teaching about the Cold War, insofar as you do teach it, between the use of textbooks and the use of actual documents, speeches, communiques, transcripts of negotiations?
Well, I would say that the greatest advantage of teaching the Cold War is that you can actually use motion pictures and video to a much greater extent than you can anywhere else. And I think to do something like with the Cuban Missile Crisis or Vietnam, students are probably much more affected by moving images than they are by historical documents.
I don't know whether this is used or ought to be used, but there are wonderful websites now, like the National Security Archive site, which has tons of really interesting documentation, or the Cold War International History Project, which makes available in English translation not only our documents, but documents from the other side. Maybe we should switch quickly, unless you have other things you'd like to say. We can come back to you, to our next panelist, who is also a history teacher and may or may not have a different view of this. Richard Kostka is a retired teacher. Sorry, Robert Kostka. Tale of two Richards. Robert Kostka is a retired teacher from Bridgewater Raynham High School, who taught American history, modern European history, AP American history, and introduction to sociology for 40 years. For 20 of those years, he was chairman of the history department and also former president of the Massachusetts Council for Social Studies. And since 2011, he's been an adjunct professor at Bridgewater State University. So what's your perspective on this, Mr. Kostka?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, as you just mentioned, I am an adjunct professor right now. Yesterday, just in preparation for this, I have a class of 24 students taking Introduction to Sociology. And at the beginning of the class, I just happened to ask them if they understood the term Cold War. We're talking about college freshmen. I have one senior and a couple of sophomores. Less than half of the class knew what I was talking about. Now, we're talking about college students, we're talking about students that have been through, had to have passed the American history course in high school in order to move on to college. So when you're talking about issues like the Cold War, in an AP American history class, certainly. AP European history, likely. AP World History, I'm not so sure, because that's an awful lot of history to cover in 1 year, and how much of that time you want to spend on the Cold War is problematic. What we have, I think, is, or you had mentioned something before about raising issues. Well, if you're raising issues dealing with the Cold War, they have to have some foundational support for that. They can't just come into a vacuum. And right now, for the vast majority of kids in high schools, at least in the high schools that I'm familiar with, it's not going to resonate with them because they're not going to have a place to put it. If you were to ask the first 10 high school kids that you see, when was the Cold War, I will guarantee you at least half of them will not put it in the 20th century. They'll put it someplace else. They don't even put the Civil War in the 19th century. So, and it's not an indictment of teachers, it's not an indictment of kids. More than anything else, it's a fact that, and one of the reasons I was asked to be on this panel is because I said I had a bias towards including MCAS testing for social studies. When a subject is not tested in a high-stakes manner, it is not considered to be valuable enough to put the resources behind. So what we as social studies professionals have seen over the last 10 years is a significant loss of quality instruction for high school kids in history. You'll have a math teacher teaching a history class. You'll have a ELA teacher teaching a history class. You'll have a science teacher teaching a history class because, of course, anybody can teach history. And as my colleague mentioned to me when I was talking before, as long as you can coach. So what happens is there are, in fact, a lot of very high-quality social studies history teachers who desperately would love to drill down and talk in depth about things like the Cold War, but where would it take place? We've had schools where there used to be a 4-year requirement that had been reduced to a 3-year requirement, then reduced to a 2-year requirement because we got to fund ELA, science, and math for testing. It's not going to be any different or any better with PARCC, because the PARCC test really doesn't even have a social studies component to it. So what you're looking at is, on one hand, the public school system was created so that in a democracy, the citizens would be educated enough to make informed choices. And what have we done with this public educational system? We make it primarily let's get a job. You know, learn math, STEM, because that's where the jobs are going to be, with a failure to understand that without a civic component, how are we a democracy? How can these kids who are going to be our future understand how this whole thing works? So when I saw this panel and I saw the questions are fabulous. Whoever drew up these questions, they're really good questions. I can't imagine bringing these up with high school kids.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that they've got enough background to be able to cover it.
Did everybody get copies of these questions? Well, I'm not going to read them to you, but we have 11 questions, and most of them have to do with the substance of the Cold War or the understanding of the Cold War. Some have to do with sources, such as using journalism or pop culture. But I'm getting the impression so far that, as you said, these questions are not about to be addressed because students really aren't prepared to address them.
Bill, it doesn't look as if the audience in general has those questions.
Yeah.
Is there any way you can quickly go through?
Well, my
Not
wife
quickly.
is teaching me. She's a retired professor at Amherst, as am I. Well, how do we discuss with students the incredible, enormous loss of human life in the concentration camps? How do we talk with students about organized labor in the Cold War? How do we talk with them about the compromises that the United States made when it chose its Cold War allies, including repressive regimes? How do we talk about the role of individual leaders and their personalities in the Cold War? And it mentions Churchill, Truman, JFK, LBJ, Nixon, Thatcher, Reagan. Well, we've done some of that here. How do we use high-quality literature such as Solzhenitsyn or pop culture? What about the Cold War in Asia? So we get beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis to talk about Mao's China, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Pol Pot's killing fields. How do we use journalism to teach the Cold War? And here's a question which sounds like a college final exam question. American diplomat and academic George Kennan was the architect of the containment policy, while President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were the apostles of détente. Which was a more successful U.S. foreign policy? Well, that's a good question, but I guess the question would be, are students prepared to discuss something like that. Let me just quickly give the floor back to you, Mr. Goldberg, and do you have any response to what your fellow teacher said, particularly, I gather, about the role of the MCAS and its influence on this?
I think these are really phenomenal questions, but if you think having the MCAS test or any other high-stakes test, which would probably be a coverage race, would prepare students for answering these questions, I think that that's a very, very problematic conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go on to our third speaker, Thomas Putnam, the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. During his tenure, the library has increased the size of its collections, built a large addition, launched the nation's first digital presidential archives. He first joined the library in 1999 as director of education, later served as deputy director, graduate of Bowdoin, the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Mr. Putnam.
Thank you very much. First, it's a real honor. I want to thank Jamie and others at the Pioneer Institute to speak here. I should note we're in a historic setting. This is not only the hotel where John F. Kennedy announced his first campaign for Congress, but actually 23 years before that, it's purported that this is the hotel that he gave his first public speech ever. He was 6 years old, and he said a few words about his grandfather, Honey Fitz.
In this very room?
In this very building.
Okay.
And you also should know, and it hasn't been mentioned, and it should, since the topic is, I hope people know, that even 10 years earlier than that, in 1913, Ho Chi Minh worked in this hotel in the bake shop. And there is a photo of him. They have a little historic archives downstairs. There is a photo of him that you should see before you go. And Vietnamese people come to this, when they're in Boston, they come to the hotel because they know that Ho Chi Minh worked here. I find myself sandwiched between two professions that I greatly admire, the authors and historians that we have heard speak, and the teachers who are on the panel and who are in the audience. I started my own career teaching public high school for 2 years, and truthfully found that I was not cut out to the task. So I have incredible admiration for those who spend their days day in and day out in the classroom. And we certainly welcome all those teachers to bring their students to the Kennedy Library. We have a program that we call the Cold War Heats Up, where we engage students with documents and our multimedia exhibits to do our best to teach the Cold War. I thought I'd just make a quick substantive point and then one point related to teaching. The substantive builds off Mr. Morris's lovely metaphor that comes from the play Ario da Capo, which is the notion of the quarrel threatening to control the two principals rather than them controlling it. That's really the defining theme in a wonderful history of the Cuban Missile Crisis written by Michael Dobbs, perhaps one of the most interesting if you have time to read it, where both Kennedy and Khrushchev felt like they were losing control of these events as they unfolded. And really both men, once the crisis began, were looking for a way to disengage and not lead to a nuclear war. And in many ways, what President Kennedy was most fearful of during the crisis was that this was all somewhat of a ruse, and that what Khrushchev was hoping was to prompt Kennedy to invade Cuba so that Khrushchev could then take Berlin. That was always in the back of President Kennedy's mind during the crisis. There's slight competition between John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, so not to be outdone, I want to note that John F. Kennedy also was known to be able to keep his sense of humor during these moments of high crisis. And that's most famously captured during the Cuban Missile Crisis when a U-2 plane, American U-2, mistakenly flew over Soviet airspace. And when they told President Kennedy that, his quip was, "There's always one damn fool that doesn't get the message." Let me just talk briefly then about Berlin. I was very honored also to represent the Kennedy Library at the 50th anniversary in Berlin when JFK gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. And at that event, the former advisor to the Berlin mayor at the time, Willy Brandt, spoke. He was a man named Egon Bahr. And he said at the time, both he and Mayor Brandt were very, very critical of John F. Kennedy's response to the building of the wall, They felt that it was a weak response, and they wanted a far more aggressive military action. And I wanted to make the point, somewhat related to what Ms. Applebaum spoke about, that there are instances, and I think John F. Kennedy's presidency shows them, where you can show resolve while also showing military restraint. And it's certainly, I think that is a topic that you can engage students on. And I think there's a beautiful example of that, and I've put a handout related to this story of this 18-year-old boy, Peter Fechter, who tried to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin with a buddy. He's a bricklayer. It's only a week or two after the wall's been built. One imagines he had no idea that they would actually try to shoot him, that they might try to stop him, but not try to shoot him. And his buddy makes it over the wall, but he actually gets shot and is lying there screaming for help. And to me, it's a way you can engage the imaginations of students about what a Cold War is, because the East Germans who have shot him stand on their side and don't do anything to help, feeling perhaps that he's got his just deserts. And the American commander, fearing that if the Americans enter into that neutral space, that Cold War could become a hot war. And so the command is to allow Peter Fechter to lie there and basically bleed to death. The Americans throw him some first aid equipment, but of course he can't administer it. The West Germans are screaming, how can you allow this young man to lie there? And again, there are photos that I've sent out that I think teachers could use to engage students. And then I believe as a teaching moment, and I've also copied a really lovely essay that was in the New Yorker when the Berlin Wall came down, that's perhaps challenging. I think you could use with AP high school students, but I think you could use the content of it for really a general class as we watch Americans be beheaded these days. When the American government is trying to decide what do we do, it's the equivalent of watching a Peter Fechter die in front of you. And the question is, how do you show both resolve and should you show restraint? And I thought I'd just read to conclude with this lovely essay by Amy Davidson. She said, "Still, the problem presented by the Fechter case has not gone away. What does it mean to be on the side of freedom in a situation where the obvious options, cynical detachment or high-minded engagement, a wall or a war, all seem degraded or catastrophically dangerous? Tossing a dying man a first aid kit can seem like an insult, and being the beacon he was running toward offers little satisfaction. What's left is to keep pushing and looking as the East Berliners did for another way through. It can be hard to see the sum of small moves of each brick displaced until the day when the whole structure comes falling down." So again, I offer that small little case study for teachers to perhaps be able to bring back to their classrooms to engage them on this angelic-looking 18-year-old boy who was perhaps seeking a better life for himself and was a casualty to this Cold War that we're talking about.
Thank you. And our last panelist is Harry Wu, the founder and executive director of the Lao Gai Research Foundation in Washington, D.C., dedicated to public awareness about Lao Gai, China's extensive system of forced labor camps. Mr. Wu spent 19 years in 12 Lao Gai. I guess Lao Gai is the equivalent of Gulag, right? Is that the, must be. He is the recipient of numerous human rights awards, the author of, or editor of 7 books, and he is also, his foundation is one of the supporters of this very day's program.
You know, in this conference, I only recognize Annie Applebaum. I really respect her. The first time he published a book, I attended a meeting. And in 2007, we invite him participate in the anti-righteous movement ceremony in Freedom House. The rest of the people, I never know about it. I'm very sorry, I don't know about it. Okay. Even today, the topic is talking about the Cold War. I knew it, but my motherland is a part of Soviet socialist family systems. You know, in the many years from Korea to Vietnam, include China, and far away to East Germany, Poland, This is a socialist family. I don't know what's going on, because I was in a prison camp because my father was a banker. He was a capitalist, is a target of communism revolution. Chinese communist revolution want to abolish 2 classes. All the landlord class was killed, and most of the capitalist class was abolished. My brother was killed because he was suspect, intent to insult Chairman Mao. I was in the camp, I was sentenced to life. I don't know what's going on, because we only have one language. Long live Chairman Mao. That's it. I don't have a pen, I don't have a paper. Every day I just looking for food. If I find the rats, if I find the frogs, I can teach you now today how to catch the rats. Even I was a graduate student from Beijing College of Geology. So what else? But 19 years later, 1979, I got the release. Finally, Mao was passed over. I understand I left the small camp. I still remain in the big caves. Even today, many people want to escape from China because it is communist totalitarian terror regime. But many Americans, maybe include you, quite not understand what is going on. Okay? Recently, David Shamborn, a professor of Georgetown University, wrote an article saying, hey, right now, the Chinese regime come to the last stage. Hey, this guy was a guest, honored guest of Chinese Communist regime, with Ossenberg, with Henry Kissinger. And what is it? When 1990 I testified in American Senate, the Senate asked me, say, we want to hear a story. I said, okay, I'll tell you my story. And then they were shocked. Say, what is a Lao guy? I said, what is a gulag? Gulag is not a word. Any can tell you about it. It's made by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But Lao Gai, I want to say, Lao Gai is Chinese word, Chinese pronunciation. Okay? Every Chinese understand it. And I ask you, where is your father? My father was in Lao Gai. We did not say my father was in imprisonment or in jail. We don't use the word. I told you my brother was in Lao Gai. Very, very popular in government document everywhere. But America never heard about it. But you know, if you want to control the people, control the government, if some people disagree or you want to remove them, of course you can kill it. Yeah, Chinese executed a lot of people, including Tibetan, including Uyghur. But many people are in the labor camps. I was there. When I came to the United States, I cannot speak English. No money. Although I was a scholar, visiting scholar of UC Berkeley. I studied geology, but I know it's over. I told the people, say, I'm a free man in a free country. I'm very lucky, but I said, okay, probably I have 10 years, 15 years to life. And American, the egg, the banana, the milk, so cheap, so good. I never have a piece of meat during the 19 years. It's okay. But the Senate gave me encouragement. See, we want to know how many camps, how many people there. Unfortunately, I can tell you that China probably have 40 million. 40 million. It means the Soviet Gulag victim, 25 million, plus the Hitler concentration camp, 12 million, add together less than Chinese victims. But Americans say, no, we don't know about it. I met Clinton. I met Bush. I show Bush, here's the resolution of the American Congress in December 2005, condemned the Chinese laogai system. I say, if you are the President of the United States, can you make an announcement? One sentence. Is that okay? He said, I will. But you never heard about it. I met Obama. I give him my book. And he write a letter response. I read your book. Keep your work. Woo. Keep your work. But most of the people right here, I want to ask you one more question. How many are you are Catholic? Illegal in China. 70 years, illegal. The first 30, 40 years, there's no Catholic church at all. And then 1983, they set up Patriarchal Catholic Church. Oh yeah, they have a priest, they have bishop, maybe soon they'll have a pope. It's strange? No, this is Chinese Catholic. This is a communist regime. Well, I'm very sorry. I cannot want to make any comments on the Cold War, but I knew it. I knew two more things. American fight against China in Korea. American fight against with China in Vietnam. Henry Kissinger stopped the war. That's it. Today, American politics mostly focus on Middle East. Russia, so yeah. I don't think Russia in the next 20 years will become an enemy of the United States. Putin is not really good. But Putin is very different from Stalin. Very different from Khrushchev. Okay. But the people, according to their experience, they still want to, talking about Cold War, talking about tear down the wall. Well, here's the people, shot in front of Berlin Wall. In 1990, when Soviet system collapsed, and hey, Soviet take another 11 years solve the land ownership systems. Okay? All the land become private land. And today, why American entrepreneurs so much they like to business in China? Because one of the problems is all the land owned by the government. No private land at all. They kill all the landlords, take over their lands, take over the ownership. So this is a major one of the issue. Although in India, in Indonesia, they have a labor force. But most of the land owned by the people. So if you have a good relation with government, you talk to the prime minister, talk to the government of province, they solve the land problem. Because all the land owned by the owned by the government. Although today China comes regime no longer, how many years we can solve the private ownership system of the land? We do not know. China is a crazily, stupidly want to have the money. They grab the money, today they want to immigrate to the United States. Maybe very soon it will change. Let me remind you, I was here 2007. No, I'm not sure. 1997. I was in Harvard. Harvard at that time, in 1997, they invite Chinese President Jiang Zemin to give a speech. Jiang Zemin gave a speech in Little Church from 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock. And the Harvard also invite me. So can you come here after Jiang Zemin's speech, you talk to the people? I said, okay. So I was there from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock opposite the Little Church of the Memorial Hall. What I said? I said, I don't know what's going on. The Chinese Communist leader as a welcome honored guest over here. But I want to remind you one thing. Today is 1997. What's happened 40 years ago? Do you know that? 1957. Khrushchev invited all of the world communist leaders, including the French, Italian communist leader. Of course, Chinese leader, Korea, gathering in Moscow, celebrate what? Celebrate 40 years Soviet Revolution, 1917. 1970 to 1957. And I quite remember the 1907 is the year I was labeled as a counter-revolutionary. And Mao gave a speech in Moscow. He said, today the world is the east wind blow over the west wing. You know what is that? East wing means socialist country, socialist systems. And the west wing is the capitalism systems. And he added, today the capitalist system just like a sun setting down. Socialist system just like a sun rise up. And today in 1997, where is Moscow? Where is Moscow University? And what? I heard Jiang Zemin yesterday, he was in New York stock market. Oh my God. I said, how can we go to New York stock market? As a communist, the first thing is destroy the capitalist market, right? I said, what about another 40 years, 2037? Chinese Communist Party will finish, we're gone. But today, is anyone talking about it? Unfortunately, no, not at all. Anyway, I talked too much, too far away from this conference. But I just want to remind everyone, China is a very, very strange country. From the last couple of thousand years until this moment, China's empire systems. Mao Zedong is a big empire in China. China never became a republic. Okay?
Excuse me,
So,
Mr. Wu.
yeah, I will finish, yeah. So I'm saying China definitely a tour to democracy and freedom. We have a small museum in Washington, D.C., talking about the Laogai system. No any single word from me. All these government documents, classified documents, from 1950, 1960 until today. And thousands of people testimony. Unfortunately, I can't write a book. Okay. I wish there's a Chinese Annie Appleton in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 5 or 10 minutes at most for questions, comments from the audience. I can call on people. Does somebody have the mic? Okay. Please. Yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. This is more of a comment. Mr. Koska, you said, my name is Isa Zimmerman, and do a lot of pro bono work in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm also a former English and history teacher in middle school. I think it's very important for the audience in this room to know that those of us who are advocating more STEM instruction in the schools in Massachusetts and across the country are not advocating for it at the expense of any other subject. In fact, there are several acronyms that have grown, like STEAM, which includes the arts. So I'd be happy to talk with you about it. I wish that everyone in this room leaves understanding that STEM is not exclusive. It does not exclude any other subject. Our children, to succeed in their future, need to know about everything that's in the curriculum in schools and some of what's not and should be. Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Quick response.
Yes. I think the problem that I see it, at least the way I see it from my standpoint, is that, in fact, we had this discussion at a social studies meeting last weekend. If we want them to reinstitute the MCAS test for social studies, we understand it's going to be at the expense of something else, whether it's going to be world languages, whether it's going to be art, music, because there's a finite amount of resources out there, and that's the problem. The problem is the finite amount of resources. So if you're going to expand one area, it comes at the expense of another area.
I'll remain seated only because of the people behind me. I have two comments and a question. The first comment is, Mr. Wu, I'm very pleased that you were here. The Sino-Soviet and Sino-American relations are extremely important with regard to the Cold War. And so therefore it was very appropriate that your comments, were delivered in enlightening us and reminding us about the fact that the Cold War was much larger than simply the Soviet Union versus the Western world. So thank you for that. Secondly, I want to extend a great deal of thanks to the Pioneer Institute for being the voice and one of at least the most important sounding boards on the issue of history and social studies. Yes, we are suffering a great deal. So I want to thank the Pioneer Institute for its resolve and its work in reminding us of the importance in our educational system. As a former teacher and now a civic education consultant, I want to ask the following question. To enlarge upon some of the comments by Mr. Koska, I'd like to be a clarion, if I can, to some of the perhaps unintended consequences, yet the reality of what is happening within our schools. We are seeing an emasculation of the history and social studies departments, as many school districts are now considering forming a Department of Humanities headed by the English language arts areas at the expense of history. I am not trying to say that this is in all respects. I'm just saying that the way in which the message is being delivered, it is intended to support ELA instruction and, in essence, minimizing the importance of educating in history and other social studies. We are hearing of school districts who are not replacing social studies teachers as they retire in doing what Mr. Koska said, which is having people in other disciplines teaching one course outside of their discipline, which is allowed under Massachusetts law, in doing so in the areas of history. So my question is, do you find it important for us to be able to come back to the issue of promoting history as an equal discipline to the others? And if so, how can we reverse this trend? Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to that, or have you already? Let's take more questions.
In this whole discussion, I have not heard the word propaganda. Now, I have lived through propaganda by the Soviet Union in Poland. I have lived through propaganda in Germany by the Soviet Union. And I was just wondering, since we are in the another Cold War right now, how we counter the propaganda from the other side, not from our side, because as soon as I say propaganda, people think that the United States is doing a good job or a bad job and is being made the villain of it. I think we need to somehow recognize that the other side is using propaganda for its purposes, and I was wondering how to counter it.
Does anybody care to respond to that? Yes. Two teachers, yes, Mr. Goldberg.
I guess I think the best way to counter propaganda is to make students into critical thinkers. And I think the best way to teach critical thinking is to do something like these big questions that were before you. And I think the antithesis of big question teaching is teaching to a high stakes test. And as much as I am in favor of history teaching and having students be civic minded and be knowledgeable, I really don't think the way to get there is by having yet another high stakes test.
Hi, I feel very fortunate to be teaching at an IB school, an International Baccalaureate School, in which the students do get to ask big questions about history, and they're just about to start on a historical investigation in which they can choose any topic as long as it's 10 years past. And maybe from some of the speakers today, if you were 16 years old and you could choose a topic to study for the next 6 weeks about the Cold War, what would you choose?
Oh, I wasn't sure who was supposed to try to answer that. Any of the keynote speakers? Me? Anybody else? Your question was?
If you were 16 and had 6 weeks to study any topic about the Cold War in depth, so you're going to have to write 2,000 words about it, but you can pretty much choose anything, what would you choose?
I hate to think that the first thing that pops into my mind is the old favorite Cuban Missile Crisis. But it does, because it's thought to be, justifiably so, one of the main events of the Cold War. And it still is somewhat mysterious as to how it happened and why, in particular, my man Nikita sent those missiles to Cuba. And because the students read my chapter on the Cuban Missile Crisis, they'll find an answer.
The question that just arose really gets at what I think is at the heart of how to teach history to high school students and engage them in history. And with all due respect, I disagree with the solution to our problem being another high-stakes history test. I agree with Rich Goldberg, and I'll take a little credit for him being here today because he is my son's beloved history teacher, former history teacher from Brookline High, and he really, if I were more erudite, I'd know who I'm quoting when I say that education is about lighting a fire, not filling a pail. Does anyone know who said that? But I think that what Richard's genius is that he lights the fire, and in my son's case, he lit a fire in him, and a love of history, he's just become obsessed with history and goes wherever he can to read and look online, and he could probably answer all these questions that we bemoan young people not knowing the answers to because the fire was lit. And I think the way you do that is not by these coverage, teaching to a high-stakes test where you have to cover everything superficially and not in depth, by giving students the opportunity to grasp onto something that lights their imagination, makes them want to go deep in a very memorable way, and teaches them the tools that they'll take with them into college and, be able to do the kind of research that you have to do in college and remain a lifelong learner. So I just want to thank Rich for being that kind of a teacher to my son.
I'm looking at Jamie because I know, Jamie, you had wanted to end this portion at 10:25. It's 10:32. Do you want?
I think it's a wrap. So.
Thank you, Professor Taubman, and all the members of the panel. Just in closing, for your very varied expression of viewpoints. Just in closing, I want to remind everybody that Pioneer Institute will be hosting a World War II event on May 4th, which is the 70th anniversary of Victory Europe Day. Again, we'll have 2 Pulitzer Prize winners addressing us, Rick Atkinson, who's done the book Liberation Trilogy, and David Kennedy on the domestic life in America during the Great War and the Depression. At the conclusion of this segment, we have several authors here who will be doing a book signing. Ann Applebaum will be signing Gulag and Iron Curtain. Edmund Morris will be doing a book signing of The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Dutch and This Living Hand. William Taubman will be signing his book Khrushchev, The Man in His Era. Harry Wu will do a signing for his book Bitter Winds. So for everybody's participation, for everybody's attendance, I want to say thank you, and I hope you come back in May. Thank you very much.